A man who became at various points in his life the wealthiest private individual in the world, whose specific oil company investments in the Arabian Peninsula in the early 1950s generated returns that no conventional financial analysis of the available geological and political information at the time could have reliably predicted, who was so personally frugal that he installed a pay telephone in his English country house for guests to use rather than allowing them to make long-distance calls on his account, and who became one of the most studied figures in the history of American oil wealth for a specific quality of commercial judgment that he himself consistently described not as genius or analytical sophistication but as a specific combination of patience, willingness to accept risk that others found frightening, and an almost temperamental inability to panic during market downturns when every observable social signal was telling him that selling was the rational response. His name was Jean Paul Getty. Born in 1892 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the son of George Franklin Getty, who had himself built a modest oil business in Oklahoma in the early years of the 20th century, he studied at Oxford in England before returning to work in his father's oil fields, where he made his first personal oil deal at 23 and his first $1 million by age 24, working within an industry whose specific economics he had studied from childhood at unusual depth. The specific investment decision that most clearly illustrates the quality of commercial judgment Getty possessed, and the specific temperamental characteristics that made that judgment genuinely unusual, was his pursuit of oil rights in the so-called neutral zone between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait beginning in the late 1940s. The neutral zone was a specific piece of desert territory whose oil potential had been evaluated and specifically rejected by virtually every major oil company that had looked at it, on the basis of geological surveys that were not encouraging and political circumstances that were genuinely complicated. Getty pursued the concession anyway, paying approximately $12.5 million for the rights in 1949, a sum that represented a very large portion of his then available capital and that most of his contemporaries at the time considered almost certainly a severe financial mistake. Morgan Housel has written that the specific investment decisions that produce the most dramatic long-term wealth outcomes are almost by definition the ones that look most frightening at the time they are made, because any investment that is obviously safe and obviously promising has already been priced to reflect its obvious characteristics, and therefore can only generate conventional returns. The specific investments that generate genuinely extraordinary returns are almost always ones that the relevant professional community has evaluated and specifically rejected, which means that making them requires a specific combination of independent analysis and temperamental willingness to be wrong in a very public and very expensive way. Getty's neutral zone decision had both of those characteristics in abundance. The oil discoveries in the neutral zone concession beginning in 1953 eventually proved to be among the most commercially significant in the history of Middle Eastern petroleum development. Getty's specific willingness to pay what seemed at the time like an excessive price for a concession that most professional analysts had dismissed as geologically unpromising, and to wait through multiple years of expensive exploration before the discoveries that validated that willingness were made, produced a return on his specific investment that most subsequent financial historians have described as one of the most dramatic single investment outcomes of the 20th century. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized a specific and counterintuitive principle that he called the margin of safety, the idea that the specific investor most likely to achieve exceptional long-term returns is not the one who most accurately predicts the future performance of specific assets but the one who most consistently purchases assets at prices that provide a specific measurable buffer between the purchase price and a conservative estimate of the asset's intrinsic value, so that even significant errors in the analysis do not produce catastrophic losses. Getty's specific neutral zone decision cannot easily be described as a classic margin of safety investment in Graham's terms, since the geological case for oil discovery was genuinely uncertain. What it shared with the margin of safety philosophy was the specific temperamental characteristic of being willing to pay a price that reflected genuine uncertainty rather than optimistic projection, and of being psychologically prepared for the specific scenario in which the investment produced no return at all. Daniel Kahneman's research into how the specific emotional characteristics of individual investors shape their investment outcomes, particularly how tolerance for uncertainty and discomfort during periods of ambiguous or adverse developments determines whether an investor can hold a position long enough for its underlying thesis to be validated, applies directly to understanding what made Getty's specific approach to investment genuinely unusual. Most professional investors, operating with clients' capital and under the specific institutional pressure to demonstrate ongoing competent management through regular performance reporting, face structural incentives to exit positions that are not producing visible near-term returns, regardless of whether the underlying thesis for holding them remains intact. Getty, managing primarily his own capital, faced a significantly different set of structural incentives. He could hold the neutral zone concession through years of expensive and commercially unproductive exploration specifically because no external stakeholder was in a position to demand that he sell. Getty's specific personal frugality, which was extensive enough and well documented enough to have generated its own substantial mythology during his lifetime, was not, as some popular accounts have suggested, simply a personality quirk unrelated to his investment approach. It was a specific financial behavior pattern that preserved the specific personal capital flexibility that made his concentrated, patient, high-conviction investments possible. The pay telephone in his English country house, the careful expense management, the personal negotiation over transaction details that most people of his wealth level delegated entirely to subordinates, these were not the behaviors of a man who did not understand that he could afford to be more generous. They were the behaviors of a man who had specific, personal experience of how quickly large capital positions could be eroded by expenses that individually seemed trivial and collectively proved significant. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about the specific importance of understanding the difference between assets that produce ongoing returns and personal consumption that does not applies here in an almost extreme version. Getty's specific personal consumption was, throughout his long life, minimal relative to his actual wealth, not because he was incapable of spending more, but because his specific personal financial philosophy treated every dollar of unnecessary personal consumption as a dollar diverted from the productive asset deployment that was the actual source of his wealth. Here's an honest complication worth including. J. Paul Getty's specific personal behavior outside of his investment activities was, by all documented accounts, genuinely problematic in multiple dimensions. His relationships with his 5 wives and 5 sons were characterized, in the accounts of his children and multiple biographers, by a specific emotional detachment and financial control that produced severe long-term personal consequences for multiple members of his family. The most widely known episode, his specific initial response to the kidnapping of his grandson John Paul Getty III in 1973, when he reportedly declined to pay the ransom immediately on the ground that it would make his other grandchildren more attractive kidnapping targets, has been interpreted by different observers as cold calculation, as emotional detachment, or as both simultaneously. His extraordinary investment judgment and his extraordinary personal failures coexisted in the same person throughout his long life, and pretending that one can be fully understood without the other would be specifically incomplete. George S. Clason's advice about the patient, disciplined deployment of capital into specific productive assets, and about the specific importance of not panicking during adverse market conditions or allowing the opinions of the majority to substitute for one's own careful analysis, describes the specific behavioral foundation of Getty's investment success with considerable precision, even though Getty was operating in a specific industrial and geographic context that Clason's ancient Babylonian parables could not have directly anticipated. This isn't a simple story about investment genius, geological luck, or personal eccentricity. It's a story about a man who had developed, through decades of practical experience in the specific economics of oil exploration, a specific tolerance for the particular type of uncertainty that oil geology produces, the specific patience to hold a large, expensive, long-duration commitment through years of ambiguous results without the specific emotional or institutional pressure to abandon it before the thesis was resolved. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own investment or professional life, have you ever held a specific long-duration commitment, to an investment, to a career direction, to a specific technical project, through a period of ambiguous or absent visible progress specifically because you believed the underlying thesis remained intact, rather than because the visible evidence was telling you to continue? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever made a significant personal or financial decision that was publicly or socially considered obviously mistaken at the time you made it? And if it eventually produced the result you expected, did the people who had considered it mistaken update their assessment of the decision-making process, or only of the outcome? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most honest reflections on this channel come from people who've thought carefully about the specific difference between evaluating a decision by its outcome versus evaluating it by the quality of the process that produced it. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Paul Getty did not become one of the wealthiest people in the world by making investment decisions that looked obviously correct at the time he made them. He made it by making specific decisions that looked obviously wrong to most of the professional analysts who evaluated the same information he was evaluating, and by having both the specific independent analysis and the specific personal temperament to hold those decisions through years of apparent validation of the majority view, until the minority view that he alone had maintained turned out to be specifically correct.